The morning sun cast long shadows across the training facility in General Santos City as Manny Pacquiao wrapped his hands with methodical precision. Each movement carried the weight of decades, every loop of tape a testament to countless battles fought and won. The familiar ritual had become his meditation, a bridge between the quiet moments of reflection and the explosive fury that awaited him in the ring. His phone buzzed insistently on the wooden bench beside him. Freddie Roach's name appeared on the screen, but something in the timing felt different. It was too early for their usual morning call, too urgent for casual conversation. Manny's weathered fingers hesitated before accepting the call, an inexplicable heaviness settling in his chest. The voice on the other end carried news that would reshape everything he thought he knew about his most recent victory. The boxing organization had completed their investigation, and the results were damning. His opponent from 6 months ago, the fighter who had pushed him to his absolute limits, had tested positive for performance-enhancing substances. The evidence was irrefutable, the timeline devastating. Manny set the phone down slowly, his hands suddenly feeling foreign and clumsy. The training facility around him seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer as the implications crashed over him like waves against the shores of Sarangani Bay. This wasn't just about statistics or record books. This was about the very essence of what he had dedicated his life to achieving. He walked to the heavy bag that had absorbed millions of his punches over the years. Its leather surface bore the scars of his journey from a malnourished street fighter to a global icon. But now, looking at it, he saw something different. He saw the ghost of a fight that had never really happened. A victory that had been stolen not from him, but from the sport itself. The memory of that night flooded back with painful clarity. Round after round, he had marveled at his opponent's seemingly supernatural endurance. The man had absorbed punishment that should have crumpled any fighter, yet kept coming forward with an intensity that defied human limitations. Manny had attributed it to heart, to the warrior spirit that elevated certain fighters above the ordinary. He had even expressed admiration for his opponent's resilience in the post-fight interview. Now that admiration curdled into something bitter and profound. Not anger, exactly, but a deep sadness that threatened to overwhelm him. Manny had built his entire career on the foundation of honest competition, on the belief that true greatness could only emerge through authentic struggle. Every punch he had thrown, every drop of blood he had shed, had been in service of that sacred principle. The irony wasn't lost on him. Throughout his career, he had faced whispers and accusations from critics who couldn't believe that a man from his humble beginnings could achieve such heights without artificial enhancement. He had endured those doubts with quiet dignity, allowing his performances and his character to speak for themselves. Yet here he was, discovering that he had unknowingly participated in the very deception he had spent his career fighting against. Jinky's footsteps echoed softly in the hallway outside the training room. She would know something was wrong the moment she saw his face. After all these years together, she could read his moods like ancient script, understanding the subtle differences between pre-fight tension and genuine distress. He wasn't ready to explain this to her yet, wasn't ready to put words to the complex emotions churning inside him. The revelation had transformed his most recent victory into something hollow and meaningless. But more than that, it had forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about the sport he loved, about the institutions he had trusted, and about the legacy he would leave behind when his gloves were finally hung up forever. Manny stepped outside into the humid morning air of General Santos City, seeking solace in the familiar chaos of his hometown. The streets were already alive with vendors setting up their stalls, children walking to school in their crisp uniforms, and the eternal symphony of jeepneys honking their way through narrow roads. This was his sanctuary, the place where his journey had begun with nothing but determination and raw talent. He walked without destination, his feet carrying him along paths worn smooth by decades of similar wanderings. The revelation continued to echo in his mind, each repetition adding new layers of complexity to his emotions. The pharmaceutical enhancement hadn't just given his opponent an unfair advantage, it had robbed both fighters of the authentic competition that made boxing sacred. As he passed a small sari-sari store, the elderly owner, Teodoro, waved from behind his counter. The man had been selling snacks and drinks to neighborhood children since before Manny became famous, treating the world champion with the same gentle familiarity he showed everyone else. Manny nodded in return. grateful for these moments of normalcy that grounded him when the weight of his public life became overwhelming. The memory of his father's teachings surfaced unbidden. Rosalio Pacquiao had been a man of simple principles, despite his flaws and eventual abandonment of the family. Before the drinking consumed him, before the responsibilities became too heavy, he had instilled in young Emmanuel the importance of honest work. The irony was painful. His father had failed to live by those principles, yet they had become the foundation upon which Manny built his entire career. His phone buzzed with incoming calls from his management team, journalists and boxing officials. Word was spreading quickly through the boxing community, and soon the story would dominate headlines worldwide. But Manny wasn't ready for the circus of public relations and damage control. He needed time to process what this meant for him personally, beyond the career implications. The path led him to a small basketball court, where local teenagers were practicing their shots despite the early hour. Their laughter and competitive banter reminded him of his own youth, when sports represented pure joy rather than complex business dealings. One of the boys, Basilio, recognized him and smiled shyly. Manny had donated the basketball hoops to this court 3 years ago, a small gesture that had brought immense happiness to the community. Watching the young athletes, Manny reflected on the responsibility that came with his position. Millions of aspiring fighters looked up to him, believing that hard work and dedication could overcome any obstacle. The revelation about his opponent's doping threatened to undermine that narrative, suggesting that success in modern boxing might require more than just talent and determination. The philosophical implications went deeper than personal disappointment. If one opponent had used enhancement, how many others might have done the same? How many of his victories had been against chemically assisted opponents? The questions multiplied like bacteria, infecting his memories of battles he had once considered among his greatest achievements. He thought about his children, Jimuel, Michael, Princess, Queen Elizabeth and Israel, and the example he wanted to set for them. They had grown up watching their father compete at the highest levels, learning lessons about perseverance and integrity through his actions in the ring. How would he explain this situation to them? How could he maintain their faith in fair competition when the system itself seemed compromised? The morning heat was intensifying, but Manny continued walking, needing the physical movement to match the restless energy in his mind. His hometown offered him perspective that no luxury hotel or training facility could provide. Here, surrounded by people who had known him before fame transformed his life, he could remember who he truly was beneath the titles and accolades. The revelation had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of his sport, but it had also presented him with a choice. He could retreat into cynicism and doubt, or he could use this moment to advocate for the changes boxing desperately needed. The decision would define not just his remaining years as a fighter, but his entire legacy. The familiar creak of his front gate announced Manny's return home, a sound that had welcomed him back from countless training sessions and international fights. The modest house in General Santos City stood as a testament to his unchanged values, despite the wealth and fame that could have easily relocated him to any mansion in the world. Here, surrounded by family photographs and simple furniture, he felt most himself. Jinky was in the kitchen preparing lunch, her movements carrying the practiced efficiency of a woman who had managed a household through decades of uncertainty. She glanced up as he entered, immediately recognizing the troubled expression that had become more frequent in recent months. The weight of his revelation pressed against his chest like a physical burden, making even breathing feel labored. Their children's laughter drifted from the living room, where Princess and Queen Elizabeth were watching cartoons. Their innocent joy, a stark contrast to the complex adult world their father navigated daily. Israel's schoolbooks lay scattered on the dining table, evidence of the normal childhood Manny had fought so hard to provide for his family, despite the extraordinary circumstances of their lives. He settled into his favorite chair, the worn leather conforming to his body like an old friend. From this spot he had watched his children grow, celebrated victories, and mourned defeats. The chair had witnessed every transformation in his life, from hungry young fighter to global icon to aging warrior contemplating retirement. Now it would witness his struggle with this latest challenge to everything he believed about his sport. The memories came in waves, starting with his earliest professional fights when every bout represented survival rather than sport. He remembered the gnawing hunger that had driven him to the gym each day, the desperation that fueled his early victories. Back then, performance enhancement meant an extra meal or a good night's sleep. The purity of that motivation felt almost naive now, given what he had learned about the modern boxing landscape. His phone continued its relentless buzzing, each notification representing another person who wanted his response to the developing story. Promoters, journalists, fellow fighters, and fans all demanded his attention, his reaction, his statement. But Manny had learned over the years that immediate responses rarely served anyone well, especially when emotions ran high and stakes were enormous. The revelation had forced him to examine every significant fight of his career through a new lens. Had Miguel Cotto been clean when they met in 2009? What about Antonio Margarito, whose hand wraps had already raised questions about fair play? The uncertainty was maddening, transforming victories he had cherished into question marks that might never be resolved. Young Jimuel appeared in the doorway, his teenage frame carrying the genetic promise of athletic ability inherited from his father. The boy's presence reminded Manny of the cyclical nature of dreams and ambitions. His son had expressed interest in boxing, despite Manny's mixed feelings about continuing the family tradition in such a complicated sport. How could he guide Jimuel toward or away from boxing when he himself no longer felt certain about its fundamental integrity? The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting shifting patterns on the floor as clouds moved across the sky. Manny watched these natural rhythms, finding comfort in their predictability. Unlike the human-controlled world of professional boxing, nature operated according to immutable laws that couldn't be manipulated or corrupted. His mother Dionysia's photograph smiled down at him from the mantelpiece, her weathered face holding memories of poverty overcome through honest effort. She had raised him to believe that hard work and faith could triumph over any obstacle. The current situation tested that fundamental belief, challenging the very foundation upon which he had built his extraordinary life. The evening training session beckoned despite Manny's emotional turmoil. The gym had always been his sanctuary, a place where physical exertion could quiet the chaos in his mind. As he drove through the familiar streets of General Santos City, the weight of the revelation seemed to press against his shoulders, like an invisible opponent he couldn't shake. The wildcard gym, Philippines, stood empty except for Buboy Fernandez, who was organizing equipment with the methodical precision that had made him invaluable to Manny's team for over 2 decades. The loyal trainer's presence provided comfort without requiring explanation or conversation. Some bonds transcended words, built instead on shared struggles and mutual respect, forged through countless hours of preparation. Manny began his warm-up routine, each movement carrying muscle memory that stretched back to his teenage years. The rhythm of jump rope, the satisfying thud of gloves against heavy bags, the synchronized breathing that had become second nature, these rituals normally brought him peace. Tonight, they felt hollow, mechanical motions performed by a body, while his mind wrestled with larger questions about integrity and justice. The revelation had opened a door he wished could remain closed. If his opponent had been chemically enhanced, what did that say about the boxing commissions, the drug testing protocols, and the oversight that was supposed to protect fighters? The failure wasn't just individual, it was systemic, suggesting problems that went far beyond one compromised athlete. His thoughts turned to other Filipino fighters who had trusted the same system, young men from poor families who had sacrificed everything for a chance at glory. How many of them had unknowingly faced enhanced opponents? How many promising careers had been derailed by competitors who operated outside the rules while pretending to honor them? The heavy bag swayed under his methodical combinations, each punch carrying frustration that had been building since morning. But anger alone wouldn't solve anything. Manny had learned through decades of competition that emotional responses, while natural, rarely produced the best outcomes. Strategy required clarity, and clarity demanded emotional control. Through the gym windows, he could see the lights of his hometown beginning to twinkle as darkness settled over Mindanao. Those lights represented thousands of families, many of whom followed his career with passionate devotion. They believed in him not just as a fighter, but as a symbol of what honest effort could achieve. The responsibility of that belief had always motivated him, but now it felt overwhelming. The situation demanded a public response, but every potential statement carried risks. If he expressed anger, critics would accuse him of poor sportsmanship. If he showed understanding, they might interpret it as weakness or indifference. If he called for systemic changes, he could be labeled a troublemaker who threatened the sport's established order. His phone displayed dozens of missed calls from his promoter, Bob Arum, whose decades in boxing had taught him to manage crises with calculated precision. The veteran promoter would want to craft a response that protected Manny's reputation while minimizing damage to future business opportunities. But Manny wasn't sure he cared about business implications anymore. The revelation had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth about modern professional boxing. The sport that had lifted him from poverty and transformed him into a global icon was fundamentally compromised. Money had corrupted institutions that were supposed to ensure fair competition, creating an environment where cheating could flourish while honest fighters suffered the consequences. As he concluded his training session, Manny realized that his response to this situation would define how he was remembered long after his final fight. He could choose the safe path of diplomatic silence, or he could use his platform to demand the changes that boxing desperately needed. The decision would require courage that had nothing to do with physical bravery. The drive home through the quiet streets of General Santos City provided Manny with the solitude he needed to process the monumental decision forming in his mind. Street lamps cast long shadows across empty intersections, and the occasional late-night vendor pushed carts filled with local delicacies toward neighborhoods, where shift workers would soon emerge hungry for affordable meals. His house appeared peaceful in the darkness, its modest exterior belying the storm of emotions raging within its most famous resident. Jinky had left a plate of his favorite adobo covered in the kitchen, along with a note expressing her love and support without demanding explanations. After 30 years together, she understood that some battles required individual contemplation before they could be shared. Manny settled into his study, surrounded by photographs that chronicled his unlikely journey from street vendor to 8-division world champion. Each image captured a moment of triumph, but now they felt like evidence in a case he was building against the sport that had given him everything. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. The revelation about his opponent's doping had unlocked memories he had previously suppressed or rationalized. He remembered suspicious performances throughout his career, fighters who seemed to possess inhuman endurance or recover from punishment that should have ended their nights. At the time, he had attributed these anomalies to superior conditioning or mental toughness. Now those memories carried different implications. His laptop displayed hundreds of news articles already analyzing the scandal, with commentators offering opinions about its impact on his legacy. Some suggested the revelation enhanced his achievement, proving he had defeated a chemically enhanced opponent through skill and determination alone. Others questioned whether this discovery should prompt investigations into other fights, potentially unraveling years of boxing history. The international boxing community was fracturing along predictable lines. Some organizations called for stricter testing protocols and harsher penalties, while others downplayed the significance of isolated incidents. Promoters worried about the financial implications of widespread investigations, fearing that public confidence in the sport could collapse if too many cases emerged. Manny thought about young fighters currently training in gyms across the Philippines, dreaming of following his path to greatness. They deserved better than a corrupted system that rewarded cheating while punishing honesty. His silence would protect his own reputation, but perpetuate the conditions that allowed enhancement to flourish unchecked. The memory of his mother Dionysia, washing other people's laundry to earn money for his training expenses, suddenly felt sacred. Every peso she had sacrificed represented faith in the possibility of honest achievement. Her belief that hard work and integrity could overcome any obstacle had sustained him through his darkest moments. How could he honor that memory while remaining silent about systematic corruption? His phone buzzed with a text message from Freddie Roach, whose decades in boxing had exposed him to every form of corruption imaginable. The veteran trainer's message was characteristically brief, expressing support for whatever decision Manny made, while subtly encouraging him to speak his truth, regardless of the consequences. The clock on his desk showed past midnight, marking the end of what would be remembered as one of the most challenging days in his post-fighting career. Tomorrow would bring increased pressure from promoters, sanctioning bodies, and media representatives, all seeking to influence his response for their own purposes. But sitting alone in his study, surrounded by reminders of his authentic achievements, Manny began to understand that this moment represented more than a public relations challenge. It was an opportunity to ensure that future generations of fighters could compete in an environment that rewarded talent and dedication rather than pharmaceutical enhancement. The decision crystallizing in his mind would require courage that transcended physical bravery. Speaking truth to power had always carried risks, but remaining silent felt like betraying everything his career had supposedly represented. Dawn broke over General Santos City with the same golden intensity that had witnessed Manny's transformation from hungry street child to global icon. But this morning carried different energy, as if the universe itself understood that significant decisions were crystallizing in the modest house where Philippines' greatest fighter contemplated his next move. Manny had awakened before his alarm, his mind already clear about the path forward. The restless night had burned away his doubts, leaving behind a resolve that felt both frightening and liberating. Sleep had brought no escape from the weight of responsibility, but it had provided clarity about what needed to be done. He moved through his morning routine with deliberate precision, each action carrying the gravity of someone preparing for battle. The shower water felt cleansing in ways that transcended physical hygiene, washing away the last vestiges of uncertainty that had plagued him since receiving the devastating news. Today would mark either the beginning of meaningful change in professional boxing or the end of his influence within the sport. The kitchen held familiar comfort as he prepared his breakfast, the simple ritual of brewing coffee and toasting bread grounding him in normalcy before stepping into the storm awaiting outside. Through the window, he watched his neighbors beginning their daily routines, unaware that their local hero was about to make a decision that would reverberate throughout the international boxing community. His phone displayed dozens of messages from well-meaning advisors, each offering strategic counsel designed to protect his reputation and financial interests. Promoters suggested measured responses that acknowledged the situation without demanding systemic changes. Legal advisors recommended statements that minimized potential liability while expressing appropriate disappointment. Marketing experts proposed angles that could actually enhance his brand by positioning him as a victim of systemic corruption. But Manny had spent the night remembering voices that carried more weight than any business advisor. He thought about his first trainer, Sardo Mejia, who had taught him that boxing was about more than winning fights. The old coach had emphasized that true champions were measured by their character outside the ring, not just their accomplishments within it. Those lessons had shaped his approach to competition and life. The memory of his father Rosalio's failures also influenced his decision. Despite his abandonment of the family, Rosalio had taught young Emmanuel that men were defined by their willingness to stand up for what was right, even when such stands carried personal costs. The tragic irony was that his father had failed to live by those principles, but they had become foundational to Manny's identity. His reflection was interrupted by the sound of his children preparing for school, their voices carrying the innocent energy that reminded him why this decision mattered. Princess and Queen Elizabeth discussed their upcoming exams with the earnest concern that only teenagers could muster, while Israel practiced basketball shots in the backyard with the dedication inherited from his father. These children would inherit whatever boxing culture his generation left behind. If he remained silent about systematic corruption, he would be complicit in perpetuating an environment where cheating was tolerated and honest competition was compromised. The thought of his sons potentially entering such a corrupt system made his decision feel inevitable. Jinky appeared in the kitchen doorway, her presence offering wordless support that had sustained him through countless challenges over 3 decades. She had watched him evolve from reckless young fighter to thoughtful leader, understanding that growth sometimes required difficult choices that transcended personal interests. The morning news was already covering the developing story, with boxing analysts debating its implications for the sport's future. Some commentators called for Manny's immediate response, while others suggested that silence might be the wisest strategy until more information emerged. But Manny had moved beyond strategic calculations. The decision forming in his mind wasn't about protecting his legacy or maintaining his marketability. It was about using his platform to demand the changes that boxing desperately needed, regardless of the personal consequences that might follow. The press conference venue buzzed with anticipation as reporters from around the world gathered to hear Manny's response to the doping revelation. The wildcard gym had been transformed into a makeshift media center, its familiar training equipment pushed aside to accommodate cameras, microphones, and rows of chairs filled with journalists whose questions would soon test his resolve. Manny sat in the back office, watching through Venetian blinds as the media circus assembled outside. Each arriving reporter represented another pair of eyes that would scrutinize his words, another voice that would interpret his message for audiences across the globe. The weight of their collective attention felt heavier than any opponent he had ever faced in the ring. His decision had been made with the clarity that only comes from deep moral conviction, but the practical implications were becoming increasingly apparent. Speaking truth about systematic corruption in boxing would inevitably create enemies among powerful promoters and sanctioning bodies who profited from the current system. His remaining years as an active fighter could become significantly more complicated. The memory of his early career struggles provided perspective on the risks ahead. He had survived poverty, political turmoil, and countless critics who doubted his abilities. Each previous challenge had strengthened his resolve and deepened his understanding of what truly mattered. This situation represented another test of character, albeit one with potentially global consequences. Through the window, he could see familiar faces among the assembled media. Some reporters had covered his career for decades, witnessing his transformation from unknown prospect to international superstar. They had documented his victories and defeats with professional objectivity, but many had also developed genuine respect for his journey. Their presence provided comfort in what would otherwise be a hostile environment. His phone displayed final messages from advisors pleading for reconsideration. Bob Arum's team had crafted alternative statements that would acknowledge the situation without demanding significant changes to boxing's oversight structure. The carefully worded drafts were designed to express disappointment while avoiding language that might antagonize powerful industry figures. But Manny had moved beyond diplomatic language and strategic positioning. The revelation about his opponent's doping had crystallized his understanding that half measures would perpetuate the very problems that needed addressing. Meaningful change required unambiguous statements that couldn't be misinterpreted or diluted by subsequent clarifications. The afternoon sun streamed through the office windows, casting the same warm light that had illuminated countless training sessions in this facility. But today felt different, charged with the energy that precedes moments of historical significance. Manny understood that his next words would either inspire reform or brand him as a troublemaker willing to destabilize his own sport. His thoughts turned to young fighters currently training in gyms across the Philippines and around the world. They deserved better than a system that rewarded pharmaceutical enhancement while punishing honest effort. His silence would protect his immediate interests, but perpetuate conditions that could destroy their dreams through no fault of their own. The clock on the wall showed 15 minutes until the scheduled start time. Soon he would walk into that room filled with cameras and questions, knowing that his words would be analyzed, criticized, and debated by everyone with any connection to professional boxing. Some would praise his courage, while others would question his motives. But the decision had transcended personal considerations. This moment represented an opportunity to use his platform for something larger than individual achievement. The boy who had once sold cigarettes on the streets of General Santos City was about to challenge an entire industry, armed with nothing but moral conviction and the credibility earned through decades of honest competition. The weight of that responsibility felt both crushing and liberating, like the moment before the opening bell when fear transforms into focused determination. Manny stepped into the press conference room with the same measured confidence that had carried him through 8 weight divisions and countless title fights. The assembled media fell silent as he approached the podium, their cameras capturing every nuance of his expression. Flashbulbs created a strobe effect that momentarily reminded him of his ring entrances, but this performance would require a different kind of courage. The prepared statement in his hand represented weeks of careful consideration, but as he looked out at the expectant faces, he realized that scripted words couldn't capture the depth of his conviction. Instead, he set the paper aside and spoke from the heart about integrity, fairness, and the responsibility that comes with influence. His voice carried the weight of someone who had lived every word he was sharing. He detailed the emotional impact of learning about his opponent's doping, describing how the revelation had forced him to question not just that particular fight, but the fundamental integrity of modern boxing. His words were measured but unflinching, acknowledging the complexity of the situation while refusing to minimize its significance. The room remained completely silent, except for the persistent clicking of camera shutters. The questions that followed tested his resolve in ways he had anticipated. Reporters pressed him about the financial implications of his statements, the potential for legal action, and the possibility that his accusations could destabilize ongoing negotiations for future fights. Each query was answered with the same principled consistency, regardless of the personal costs his honesty might generate. Some journalists attempted to bait him into attacking specific individuals or organizations, but Manny refused to personalize his criticisms. His focus remained on systemic problems rather than individual failures, understanding that meaningful reform required addressing root causes rather than scapegoating convenient targets. The maturity in his responses reflected decades of growth beyond the impulsive young fighter who had once let emotions guide his decisions. As the press conference concluded, Manny felt a profound sense of relief that surprised him with its intensity. The weight he had carried since receiving the initial revelation began to lift, replaced by the satisfaction that comes from acting in accordance with deeply held principles. Whatever consequences followed, he would face them knowing he had chosen integrity over convenience. The immediate reaction was as polarized as he had expected. Boxing promoters and sanctioning body officials expressed disappointment with his irresponsible statements, while fighter advocacy groups praised his courage in addressing long-ignored problems. Social media exploded with both support and criticism, creating the kind of controversy that would dominate sports headlines for weeks. But the response that mattered most came from unexpected sources. Young fighters from around the world reached out through various channels, expressing gratitude for his willingness to speak truth about conditions they had suspected but felt powerless to address. Their messages reminded him why the decision had been necessary, regardless of the professional costs. The drive home through General Santos City felt different than his journey to the press conference. The familiar streets now witnessed a man who had chosen principle over profit, integrity over expediency. Street vendors waved as his car passed, unaware that their local hero had just challenged an entire industry on their behalf, and on behalf of honest competitors everywhere. That evening, surrounded by family in the modest home where his extraordinary journey had begun, Manny reflected on the day's events with quiet satisfaction. Jinky's supportive presence and his children's unconditional love provided perspective that no amount of professional criticism could diminish. He had made his stand, and history would judge whether his courage had contributed to meaningful reform. The revelation about his opponent's doping had initially felt like a devastating blow to everything he believed about competitive sports, but his response had transformed that crisis into an opportunity to advocate for the changes that boxing desperately needed. Whether those changes would actually occur remained uncertain, but at least the conversation had begun in earnest. As night settled over his hometown, Manny understood that some victories were measured not by scorecards or championship belts, but by the willingness to stand for principle when standing required genuine sacrifice.